Do you feel like a road in North Carolina that is always under construction?
Failure can make you think you always need fixing, but you're in good company.
Let's talk about it. Today we're going to talk about some faithful followers of God who nevertheless really failed in some big ways. So if you feel like you're constantly under God's construction, there's hope for you. Consider these heroes of the Bible if you feel like a failure.
Moses.
He argued with God. He argued with him. He told him, I can't even speak. God, you want me to go speak for your people? I can't even speak. I'm a stutterer. I'm no good. You know, he didn't want to lead his people out of Egypt. He finally did it, but then later he got so angry with those people that he led out of Egypt, with God's people, that he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because he misrepresented God to the people. But God used him anyway. Moses got to do some major miracles, right, by the hand of God.
Now the plagues in Egypt were kind of negative, but
God also had Moses use his staff to part the Red Sea.
Abraham.
Though he had faith enough to believe that God took him out, showed him the stars, and said, your descendants are going to be this numerous, even though you don't even have one child yet. Your descendants are going to be this numerous. It's the stars, more than the stars. But he doubted, right? And he tried to be, they were going years and years, he and his wife Sarah, and they were not having a son. Not even one son, so they took matters, right, into their own hands. And a lot of times, we blame Sarah. But I saw his only son. I saw the movie, and I recommend that. It was a touching movie. It was well done. And it gives the idea that I don't think we have ever thought of, that Sarah this is not in the Bible, we don't know for sure, but it certainly is plausible, that Sarah may have felt guilty, as if she were holding up the promise that was given to Abraham, because maybe the son wasn't going to come through her. God didn't take her and Abraham out and say, I'm going to bless, your seed and all this kind of, your child. He just took Abraham. So maybe it wasn't meant for Abraham and Sarah. Well, of course God meant it for Abraham and Sarah, but she felt bad, right? In the movie, they portrayed it as she felt bad, and she finally said, look, I'll give you my handmaiden, because clearly I'm not giving you a son, because she felt bad and didn't want to hinder Abraham's success with God, his blessing with God. If she was the problem, she wanted to remove herself out of the way. That is a theory. It's not necessarily what happened. But we always, we kind of poo-poo on Sarah because she didn't have faith, right? But Abraham also partook in that problem when he went into her maidservant, and then he did have another child through her, but that wasn't the promised one, and God said, no, that's not the way I'm going to do this. He also lied repeatedly to protect himself and put his wife in danger, put Sarah in danger repeatedly by lying and saying that she was just his sister. Well, she was technically his half-sister. They were also married, and he lied to protect himself from pagan kings killing him so they could have Sarah for themselves. So we see a man of faith, but also a man who had problems and failures.
Lot.
Also Lot, Abraham's nephew, who acted very immaturely, to hand over his virgin daughters to these crazy guys who were just going to gang rape them. He was willing to do that. Now, he didn't end up doing it because angels intervened and stopped it from happening. And angels also intervened and came to rescue him and his family when God was going to destroy his city. And Lot argued with angels. He was not a very smart man. He was not a very wise man, right? And yet, later on in the New Testament, Peter calls Lot a righteous man. So, again, we see somebody who is putting their faith in God, but then we see some ways that they've lived, and it doesn't look very good. Jacob is another.
Jacob.
Who definitely lived up to his first name that meant deceiver. And quite honestly, he did. He was deceitful. He tried to fool his father-in-law. He lied and cheated to get his father's blessing and stole it from his brother, basically the firstborn blessing. And yet God changed Jacob's name to Israel. meaning God perseveres or God prevails. So God still blessed Jacob, who became Israel. And of course, we know that, Israel is the name for the whole people of God. 12 sons of Jacob, and the tribes correspond to that, and the place where the people of God live, and all that. So, we're talking about a serious name here, that God prevails, God perseveres, rather.
Elijah.
A prophet of God, mighty man of God, who did mighty acts, mighty miracles. He had a big showdown challenge with the prophets of Baal.
Many of God's people were worshiping Baal rather than the one true God of Israel.
And Elijah said, this is terrible, this is awful, we're going to have it once for all, we're going to clear this up. So he had a showdown with the prophets of Baal, and he proved that the one God was Yahweh. He said, the one God who's really the true God, the fire will come down and consume. You make a sacrifice on your altar, and I'll make a sacrifice on my altar. And just for good measure, I'll pour water all over. I'll just saturate this altar and everything around it with water on my side, to show you even more how powerful my God is, because he's going to soak up all that water and burn up everything. There'll be so much fire coming down from heaven. And that's exactly what happened. And right after that amazing thing that happened, that amazing feat, and how he saw the fire of God come down from heaven and act on his behalf when he claimed that he was the only God, he ran for his life from Queen Jezebel, who hated him. She said, you kill these prophets tomorrow, you're going to be look the same as those prophets, buddy. So you better run for your life. I'm putting you on notice. And Elijah did. He ran. And you're thinking, what in the world, Elijah? You just did all this power of God stuff. What are you doing? Were you running? And he even asked God to just take his life. Just get him out of here. He didn't want to live anymore. And instead of answering the prayer that way, God provided for him, gave him rest and food. And ultimately, God raptured him. And he never died. Elijah never died a normal death like every other man. And so, it's pretty amazing that God loved him and treated him so well after he had such little faith there. He did, but then he didn't, right? So there's another example of failure, right there, of a mighty man of God.
We briefly interrupt this episode for a word from our sponsor. SP Designer Brand T-shirts. Get yours for this fall. Long sleeve available. Link in the description. This is a viewer-supported ministry, so please feel free to stop on by Patreon and support me or buy me a coffee. And I always love to have your subscription. Thank you.
Gideon.
Gideon was one of the judges. He failed. He was hiding out in a wine press trying to thresh grain, hiding from the enemies of Israel because he didn't want to be found. So he was, threshing grain in this place. An angel appeared to him and said, "Oh, mighty man of valor." And Gideon's like, are you kidding me?
Are you talking to me?
What are you talking about, right? And yet God used him to defeat
the Midianites, who the Bible says were like locusts coming down and consuming all the Israelites' crops.
And what's amazing there is he used Gideon as that judge who was afraid and hiding out, and he did it by thinning out his army to where there was only 300 men, so that God would get the glory. So it's kind of crazy. It seems like Gideon had a right to kind of be afraid because he kept thinning his armies out after he called him to do it. I would have been afraid then. I would have gone, God, what are you doing? Give me a break. Stop taking my soldiers away. But God was like, no, I'm going to thin this out so you're going to know it's me, right? That gives you the victory, not yourself, Gideon. It was like the original 300, right? We got the movie 300. Well, that Gideon's army was like and God working through him was like the original 300, which I think is really cool.
David.
Greatest king of Israel, right? Known for being the greatest king. Established the lineage from where the Messiah came, right? Where Jesus can trace back his lineage to David. And he committed adultery and murder. He also had a pretty bad record as a father. He was not a very good father. He had sons running amok. He had a son that was tried to take over his throne. Steal his throne, run him out of town. and just a very sad family picture in a lot of ways. A lot of bad things happening with his family. And yet he was called a man after God's own heart, by God.
Peter.
Even after hearing directly from the mouth of Jesus himself that if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before the Father. That's what Jesus said in Peter's own hearing in Jesus' teaching. And Peter heard that. And he did it. He denied Jesus. And Jesus even told him, you're going to deny me. He says, oh no, never Jesus, never do such a thing. I would go to my death for you. And then he denies him 3 times with cursing and swearing. And yet God forgave Peter, restored Peter, and Jesus said, Peter, you, Kepha, on this little rock, on this piece of this rock, I, the rock, will build my church. Right? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy what God will do with us. Right? Even when we fail.
Oh.
Lastly, zealous for honoring Yahweh through Judaism, was hell-bent, right? After Jesus, was crucified. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and he was hell-bent on getting rid of all the followers of the way, all the followers of this Yeshua, he thought false Messiah, bad guy, deceiving people and telling people to worship him and all that. We're not going to have any of that. We will get rid of these people, these blasphemers who are worshiping Jesus. How terrible. Until Jesus met him on the road to Damascus and said, Paul, why do you persecute me? And he realized, wow. He said, who are you, Lord? He said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And so Jesus set him straight, and he later called himself the chief of sinners because he was trying to kill all those faithful to the Lord. But God called Paul righteous by faith and gave him the responsibility of writing over half the New Testament. And again, with the emphasis on grace, right? Mr. Lawman, Paul. So are you a failure today? Does it seem that God is putting out the cones of construction for your life every time you turn around to fix you again? Now, this once atheist, he looked at these struggling this way, the people around him they call themselves Christians, struggling. He looked at them this way. It looked to me as though most people who claim to be Christians did not live as if they took their faith seriously. With a few exceptions that I treated as anomalous outliers, Christians didn't seem to live like people who owed their entire existence and purpose to a creator. Either these people who claim to be Christians were quite stupid, or they didn't believe what they claimed. Now keep that in mind for later. Now that is a quote from a book called Miracles Today by Craig S. Kinnear. He's a New Testament scholar and author, and he is now a Christian. So you can read more about him and find out, how his story went and how he got there. But the point is, some of us feel like that in the church. We look around at people claiming to be Christians and we go, you're not living as if you take your faith seriously. Or people that we know that aren't Christians, and they question us because they go, look at all these Christians sinning, right? Look at all these leaders falling in the church, ministers and pastors and so forth. If you have struggled with repeated sin and addiction, you might feel as if you will never be good enough for God. You may think that you are never going to mature. And if you really know God, you want your actions, your life to reflect Christ in everything you do. That's your heart's desire, because he's given you a new heart. He's put his desires in you. And so you're going to want that. And when you're not meeting it and you're failing, and you're not just failing a little, but you keep failing, and especially in the same area, it's going to break your heart when you have his new heart in you.
But take heart, if you will. Jesus has overcome the world, and he is your high priest when you're in need. He has a better way for you, friend, a path of victory. So join me next time. Let's talk more about that very thing. Don't take my word for it in the meantime. Take God.